You're listening to a special edition of We Get Work, recorded live from Workplace Horizons 2025 in New York City, Jackson Lewis's annual labor and employment law conference. Over 500 representatives from 260 companies gathered together to share valuable insights and best practices on workplace law issues impacting their business today. Here's your personal invitation to get the insights from the conference delivered directly to you. We'll see you in 2026. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us live from Workplace Horizons at the We Get Work podcast studio. I'd like to welcome to the studio this afternoon Jeff Brecker, principal in Jackson Lewis's Long Island office, Doug Klein, principal and office managing principal of the New York City office, and Scott Jang from the West Coast in Jackson Lewis's San Francisco office. I'm going to first ask you just a quick question. Scott, starting with you, tell us a little bit about your practice and what you're hearing from employers in 2025.
Thanks, Alicia. My practice primarily covers complex litigation, so wage and hour class actions, as well as a little bit of single plaintiff work, and of course, a lot of advice and counsel, especially when it comes to arbitration agreements. That's been a big focus, not only in California, but especially for my practice. There's been a lot of developments, as I'm sure we'll talk about here, and that has pretty much been a big focus that I've been seeing from my clients and employers.
Doug, what about you, New York City?
So my practice is split 50-50 between litigation defense and advice and counsel. On the litigation side, a lot like Scott, I defend a lot of class and collective action cases, particularly wage and hour cases, and where these agreements, these arbitration agreements, which we'll talk about in class action waivers, continue to be the subject of intense litigation. And on the advice and counsel side, a lot of leave management issues that continue to crop up. Something else we've talked about in other sessions here, issues of mental health and leave issues with sensitivity considerations continue to be a very hot topic that I am presented with.
And Jeff?
Yes, so I'm the litigation manager for the Long Island office and also head of our wage and hour practice group nationally. And so I spend a lot of time litigating wage and hour cases and also giving advice on wage and hour issues, but also handle a wide variety of other cases, litigation involving discrimination cases. And recently we've seen an uptick, I would say, in independent contractor misclassification cases. So that's taking some of our time as well.
Okay. So the title of your presentation today was Arbitration, Still the First Line of Defense with a question mark. So what is the answer? And can you provide a brief summary of your presentation?
Yeah, so we had a jam-packed hour with, we covered a lot of topics, a lot of the emerging topics, but we first discussed the pros and cons of arbitration and whether or not it still is a good strategy for employers to implement arbitration agreements, primarily due to the class waiver. But we also discussed some emerging issues relating to exclusions from the Federal Arbitration Act, including the transportation worker exception, which has been expanded by the Supreme Court, and an amendment to the Federal Arbitration Act that excludes sexual harassment and sexual assault cases from being arbitrable. So those cases are now excluded, and how to draft agreements to reflect that change and what impact that could have. We addressed issues relating to very practical, I would say, advice on drafting arbitration agreements, which provisions to include, what provisions to exclude, and also very practical advice on how to roll out arbitration agreements to ensure that the agreement is going to be enforceable and that you'll be able to find it. Because a lot of times what we talked about is the employer implements a arbitration agreement and they have this beautiful arbitration agreement and the employee signed it, but they just can't find it. So we talked all about just a lot of practical issues involving ensuring that once it is executed properly, that we can find it, and that and what strategies we can have for enforcing it.
So, Doug, Jeff just told us that the session was jam-packed, and it certainly sounds like it was. When you guys were preparing for the session, how did you decide what to cover, given all the change that's happening and what's going on?
think the issues that Scott and Jeff and I are confronted with are similar. Scott brings a unique perspective in California because it is a place unto itself and always presents particular considerations. So we wanted to be sure to add a California hint to the conversation, which we certainly did. But just to piggyback off of what Jeff said a little bit, trying to make it practical, workplace horizons. We've talked about, looking ahead and what's to come. The landscape with arbitration agreements is far from settled, and we wanted to be sure to put issues on folks' radar, what to be thinking about, how often to be thinking about, updating agreements. And what to be on the lookout for. What are the plaintiffs' lawyers, for example, what new tricks are they pulling out of their hat to try to avoid arbitration, which is often what a plaintiff will try to do. And the employer's goal often is to compel arbitration and kind of the push and pull there. But it was a very practical conversation.
Did you bring your crystal ball for that one, Doug?
We did. We were clear to say though that there are no guarantees. But we are at the forefront of litigating these issues. Jeff and I here in New York and across the country in some other cases. Scott primarily in California with his perspective. But there's a lot going on in the arbitration space, so it was a good conversation.
So there's a lot going on in the arbitration space. What issues really resonated with the attendees? Would you say, Scott?
Well, I think Doug's zingers against Jeff were a particular hit with the audience, but on a substantive, there were many, they were good. But on a substantive level, I think there are two areas that I kind of saw our attendees light up when we discussed. One was the practical aspect of it. I do think that we're talking to professionals who are dealing with arbitration agreements, not on a kind of abstract legal aspect, but really on a day-to-day basis in terms of how are they supposed to draft these agreements, how are they supposed to roll out these agreements, and what does it look like when these agreements are challenged. And so I think a lot of our advice in terms of ways to craft your arbitration agreement, ways to roll out your arbitration agreement, and the anecdotes that we had with respect to what that looks like and the stories of how that plays out, I think resonated with our attendees, especially since I believe a lot of them had similar experiences and kind of laughed in sympathy when we were talking about some of the pitfalls that one might see when rolling out an arbitration agreement. And then the other area that I think really resonated with the group was I think the transportation worker exemption, just because that is a new line, a new area of arbitration law that we're starting to see a lot of development in. And unless you're on the front lines like Jeff, Doug, and myself, litigating these types of issues on a day-to-day basis, that transportation worker exemption seems very abstract. But I think we were able to kind of show and pivot that there is this growing trend, and this is an area of law that employers need to pay attention to and will increasingly be a larger role in terms of especially class and collective action litigation. So I think whether a good face, bad face, I can't tell, but I did think that some faces lit up when we were talking about the transportation worker exemption.
So, Jeff, we've sat across the podcast table for a couple of workplace horizons now. Scott just talked about a change, a new trend in arbitration law. What would you say are some of the real significant changes since we met last year across the table?
Yeah, I would say the rise of mass arbitrations is something that has made a lot of headlines. So a mass arbitration is where a company has an arbitration agreement that has a class action waiver, so the employees can't bring a class action. But to avoid that or sidestep that, they bring multiple arbitrations on behalf of hundreds or potentially thousands of workers. So there is no class action, but there is a mass arbitration. And we talked about the cost of those, the filing fees. And so I think that is certainly something that's grabbed a lot of headlines. Some big cases that there were mass arbitrations. A lot of it's also in the consumer context. But so we talked a lot about what a mass action is, recent amendments to the American arbitration rules and the JAMS rules to address mass arbitrations and whether to incorporate those in your arbitration agreement. So I think that was that's definitely one of the emerging, in addition to what Doug said about the transportation exemption, because that is, and then I think the last one would be the ending forced arbitration of sexual assault and harassment cases. There's been a lot of developments, just even the last 6 months, about what types of claims are covered, whether or not a case that includes a sexual harassment case but other claims means that the entire case can't be arbitrated. And so there's a growing body of case law, I would say, that's very much in dispute at the moment. There's differing views on whether, for example, a gender discrimination is covered by the prohibition because sexual harassment is a form of gender discrimination, or is gender discrimination something different than sexual harassment, in which case a standard gender discrimination case would not be covered. So that's, I would say, some of the emerging issues. So it was fun.
So Scott, covered a lot of ground, as you and your colleagues have just described. What would you say are some of the key takeaways you'd want people to know, especially for our podcast audience that didn't get the benefit of seeing you live here at the conference?
That's a great question. I would say, and this is not a gratuitous self-promotion on our part, but I think the main takeaway from our presentation is you really need to have your arbitration agreements updated regularly. As we just discussed, the case law and the laws with respect to arbitration agreements are constantly evolving, constantly being challenged. And so an employer really needs to keep up to date with respect to the arbitration agreements. It's not one of these situations where you can spend a lot of time developing your arbitration agreement, throw it on the shelf, and it has a shelf life of 10 years. You're going to have to regularly update those arbitration agreements if you want to make sure that they're enforceable. And that's not just with respect to the arbitration agreement itself. You want to make sure that with respect to your rollout process, your HRIS systems, that you really do a thorough due diligence in terms of what it actually looks like when you're rolling out these arbitration agreements to employees, because we often see that is an area rife for challenge to enforceability of arbitration agreements. So just as vigilant with respect to updating the arbitration agreement, an employer needs to be vigilant with respect to knowing what its HRA system is in terms of rolling out these arbitration agreements.
So Doug, last question. How is Jackson Lewis, how are you, Jeff, and Scott helping employers deal with a multitude of issues in this space?
We talked a lot about the applicability of the federal law, the FAA, the Federal Arbitration Act, to these agreements. But we talked a lot about exceptions now and challenges to the enforceability, which means that we're in a state law world at that point. And we talked a lot during the program about state law implications, because many states' laws are hostile to arbitration, to class action waivers, to arbitration of certain types of employment claims. And so Jackson Lewis is incredibly well suited, given our geographic footprint, to provide advice and counsel on a nationwide basis. I talk to Scott often, including just this past week, on behalf of a client with some particular California considerations on their agreement. But likewise, in other states where we need to account for state law considerations, our geographic view allows us to take a holistic approach, which is practical and efficient.
Gentlemen, Jeff, Doug, Scott, thank you so much for sharing the highlights of your presentation with us here today and for presenting to our attendees at Workplace Horizons, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate a workforce that is engaged and stable. Please tune into our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on your streaming platform of choice, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.